Until the beginning of this century, the atom was considered the smallest unit of all physical matter on Earth and in the universe. The atom was indivisible, just as the word signifies in Greek. But the discovery of light quanta, the electron, and radioactivity made it apparent that the atom was not indivisible, but rather a manifestation of an inner world, hitherto unknown, which was to afford mankind new awareness and closer contact with the innermost secrets of nature. The Danish scientist Niels Bohr was one of the greatest pioneers of atomic science, and his institute in Copenhagen was for many years the center for research into the riddles of the atom. This is the story of Niels Bohr's life.
We have been a band of enthusiastic young persons between 20 and 30 years old, in a time where a new kind of physics grew up. And we experienced, together with Bohr, how science take place.
If I tried to get one single phrase to describe Niels Bohr, I would describe him as a daring conservative. Conservative in holding fast to battle-tested principles and daring in pushing their application to the very limit.
Well, I certainly think that Niels Bohr ranks among the really first-rate scientists all over the world, and I would have no hesitation to put him besides Newton, Galilei, and Darwin, Maxwell, and Einstein.
The face was somehow divided into two parts. The upper half was the high and front, and there you see the immense intensity of thought, and his eyes looking somewhere into a place where nobody of us could look at. And the lower part was, well, a very kind Danish bourgeois.
Niels Henrik David Bohr was born in Copenhagen on October the 7th, 1885. His mother Ellen was the daughter of David Adler, a banker and politician, and his father, Christian, was an experimental physiologist and a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences. When his father was appointed to a professorship, the family moved into a flat at the Academy of Surgical Science. His father had wide-ranging interests, and as a result, Niels Bohr's home quickly became a cultural center, which attracted the leading personalities of Copenhagen. At school, Niels divided his time equally between football and science. His scientific understanding often outstripped the information provided in his school books, and Niels and his brother Harald, who was 2 years younger, were eager listeners during philosophical and scientific discussions carried on in their home. Niels was attracted to philosophy and dreamt of writing great philosophical treatises. He was fascinated by the style of the Danish poet Paul Martin Müller. He often thought about one particular sentence. On many occasions, the human being will split into two persons. One will attempt to deceive the other, and meanwhile, a third, who is really identical with the other two, marvels at the confusion. In 1903, Niels went to Copenhagen University and chose physics as his main field. He entered a competition for an essay on the oscillation of liquid jets and was awarded the Royal Society's Gold Medal. In 1907, he became preoccupied with the latest developments: the theory of relativity, X-rays, light quanta, and the discovery of radioactivity. The electron, then recently discovered, was of particular interest to him, and he decided that his doctoral dissertation should constitute a critical examination of the theories of electrons in metals. To be able to work in peace, he moved to the outskirts of Copenhagen. And there, friends introduced him to Margrethe Nølund, daughter of a pharmaceutical chemist. And even before he'd finished his dissertation, they became engaged. His public defense of his dissertation caused a minor sensation. The auditorium and the corridors leading to it were packed, and the official examiners confessed frankly that nobody in Denmark was qualified to judge his work. A grant in aid enabled Bohr to study for 1 year at Cambridge University under J.J. Thomson, the discoverer of the electron. Bohr decided to take his doctoral dissertation in an English translation with him. It contained critical comments on Thomson's theories. He had high hopes for his work with the illustrious Thomson.
Bohr never got into any real dialogue with Thomson, unfortunately. And he never actually got down to reading Bohr's thesis, which was a great disappointment to Bohr. I remember Bohr saying with a smile that also his English was not so good at the time, and so he could not express himself. He could only say to Thomson, "This is wrong."
Thomson gave Bohr routine work in the laboratory, and Bohr became increasingly worried. He felt he was wasting his time. Just when he was most unhappy, there came a turning point. He met the famous physicist Ernest Rutherford.
About a year before they met, Rutherford had made his most epoch-making discovery, namely that practically the whole mass of the atom is concentrated in a tiny nucleus, carrying a positive electric charge, around which the electrons are orbiting much like the planets around the Sun in the solar system.
Rutherford invited Bohr to work in his laboratory in Manchester. Rutherford's atomic model had been criticized by many, but Bohr was convinced that Rutherford's atomic model was correct. However, he saw clearly that the laws of classical physics were inadequate. The world of the atom could not be compared with the universe. To the surprise of his friends, Bohr decided to leave beautiful Cambridge for the industrial city of Manchester. At Manchester University, he met some of the great names in atomic physics: Henry Moseley, Hans Geiger, and the Hungarian George Hevesy, with whom he became close friends.
Bohr realized that some radically new ideas had to be introduced. And in this situation, he could build on some earlier ideas of Planck and Einstein and combine these with Rutherford's atomic model.
During the last 4 months available to him at Rutherford's laboratory, early in 1911, Niels Bohr worked day and night to find out why atoms are stable and how electrons move around the atomic nucleus. If his theories were correct, they would mean a decisive break with classical physics. As he wrote to his brother, "It could just be that I have found out a little about the structure of atoms, something that may be a tiny little bit of reality."
This was the period where he initiated the so-called Bohr atom model, which was a tentative way of explaining atomic properties that were absolutely ununderstandable before. And even this tentative way had a tremendous success. It could completely, quantitatively explain the spectrum of the hydrogen atom and of other atoms. He could explain the so-called periodic table, that means the properties of the different elements, in a not very logical, but in a kind of intuitive way.
In Bohr's first postulate, he postulated that there are certain states of the atom, the stationary states, in which, for some reason, so far inexplicable, the electrons do not emit electromagnetic radiation. On the other hand, we know that atoms do emit radiation, like light, and so Bohr in his second postulate said that this happens by a mechanism which is entirely different from what was hitherto believed. Instead of light being emitted by the orbiting electrons, this happens by a transition from one stationary state to another. And therefore the frequency of the light, the color of the light, is not determined by the revolutions of the electrons, but by the energy difference between these two stationary states divided by Planck's constant.
Bohr called the leaps quantum leaps. Bohr returned to Copenhagen to work out his theories in detail. He married Margrethe and was appointed a university reader. But Rutherford wanted him back, so he and Margrethe left for England in spite of the World War. Rutherford tried to persuade Bohr to stay, but he wanted to return to Denmark. He had grand plans. He wanted his own Institute of Atomic Physics. With the aid of friends and grants from foundations, the building was completed in 1921. His first collaborators came from abroad. His friend George Hevesy from Hungary, Svein Rosselin from Norway, Oskar Klein from Sweden, James Frank from Germany, and Hans Kramers from the Netherlands. George Hevesy and Dirk Coster identified the missing element, number 72, and named it hafnium, from Hafnia, the Latin name for Copenhagen. In 1922, Bohr was awarded the Nobel Prize. By this time, he had described the structure of the atom and the movement of electrons around the atomic nucleus. But he still didn't know what happens in the course of the quantum leap. At Göttingen, another center of atomic physics, a conference was held called the Bohr Festspiele. And Bohr had to lecture for 7 days running about his new theories.
My first meeting with Niels Bohr was 1922. Bohr was invited to give a 2 weeks lecture course. Many physicists attended to it from far abroad. Sommerfeld came from Munich and took a young blonde man with him, Heisenberg. He looked like a schoolboy. Heisenberg joined the discussion with very clear questions. He didn't agree to all what Bohr said, and he expressed it. Bohr took him then to works at the hills near Göttingen, and Heisenberg learned the free and more philosophical approach Bohr had to physics.
The period from 24 to about 30, in which quantum mechanics was developed. It's called now the golden years of physics. Indeed, I think it is one of the very few revolutions in science where ideas have been completely changed.
The task ahead was to solve the riddle of the quantum leaps. The physicist Wolfgang Pauli came from Austria, and Werner Heisenberg, who was very young, from Germany. Existing theories could not explain the atom. A completely new universe was about to be conquered.
Here, Bohr has not only given the first idea how to deal with the atom, how to understand the atom, but then later he was always the leader of the development of quantum mechanics, which is now the fundamental way of looking at atoms, and it is a revolutionary way, quite different from the old physics in the 19th century before.
When young physicists complained that they got dizzy whenever they contemplated the depths yet to be fathomed, Bohr replied that to think about quantum problems without getting dizzy would show a complete lack of comprehension. Heisenberg, a mathematical genius, abandoned visual concepts. He assumed that the electron must be thought of as a particle. But Bohr read a paper by the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger, who believed the electron must be conceived of as a wave. Bohr invited Schrödinger to come to Copenhagen. Wave and particle at one and the same time. It was a paradox of such magnitude that it almost led to a break between Heisenberg and Bohr.
There was some difference between Bohr's attitude and Heisenberg's attitude to the problems of quantum mechanics. Bohr saw more reality in the wave aspect.
Bohr went to Norway to think about it. By the time he returned, he had found an explanation. The answer lay in the principle of complementarity. The laws of the atomic world could not be explained in terms of one particular image.
He loved to talk about it. I mean, during the evenings, even in the midst of a scientific discussion, Bohr would come back to his beloved complementarity. And then he applied the complementarity also to non-physics, to human life, to human problems.
His basic point, I think, was that he said we are somehow suspended in language. We depend on language. And language has limited ways of expression. And therefore, in many cases, it is impossible to say things just in a unique manner. You must use two different words or two different concepts, which are mutually contradicting, but which are needed together in order to give a full description.
You have, as he used to say, a complementarity between truth and clarity. In German, there is a rhyme, Wahrheit and Klarheit. And this is so typical. If you want to say, as he says, if you really want to say the truth, you cannot be clear because the truth is so complicated.
When a stream of electrons is aimed at a screen with two holes, it will at first look as if the electrons strike at random. But gradually, a pattern of interference emerges. It is impossible to say whether the electron is a particle or a wave. We must be satisfied with probabilities. The decisive discussions about the laws of the atom, quantum mechanics, were held at the Solvay conferences in Brussels. Einstein was not satisfied with Bohr's explanation. He did not believe that the laws governing the universe and the atomic laws could be accidental. God, he remarked jokingly, does not play with dice. And Bohr replied, "It's not for us to tell Providence how to run the world."
Einstein said, what I want to have is a precise picture of reality in space and time. And quantum theory does not give me such a picture. And Bohr said, the question is not whether I have such a picture or not, the question is what I can know. And quantum theory says what I can know, and I cannot know such a picture, so I'm not introducing it.
The two physicists disagreed on the basic philosophical positions and never came to terms. Although by this time Bohr's atomic theories had been accepted in most scientific circles, it was still important to him to know whether Einstein was able to disprove them. Every day Einstein produced new counterproofs. And every night Bohr had to work in his hotel room so that he could refute Einstein's criticisms the next morning. Although Einstein remained dissatisfied, he was unable to produce any more counter-arguments, and Bohr's quantum mechanics became the basis for all future atomic physics. Copenhagen became the center for atomic research. From all over the world, scientists came to the Bohr Institute to experience the Kopenhagener Geist, as Heisenberg called it.
Here I came to that place and met all this international crowd. The first time I got the idea that science is really an international undertaking. There were young people from all countries, from Russia, from America, from Germany, from England, from Italy, together there around Bohr. And Bohr led them in an interesting way. He was the first among them, of course, but he was an equal. He lived like the others, he talked like the others, and here he was surrounded of an enthusiastic crowd of young people, jocular, intensely interested in having fun. And I've never seen an atmosphere of such an activity, of such an enthusiasm, of free of all conventional bonds, and penetrating into the deepest secret of nature with a spirit of joy, of insight. I remember that they made jokes all the time, practical jokes, and we had fun all the time. And at the beginning I was a little set back by this. I couldn't quite understand it, and I talked to Bohr. Bohr always talked to the new people privately at the beginning, and I said, it's a wonderful place here, but why are people so always making jokes about, after all, very serious things? And then he made this wonderful remark. He said, there are things that are so serious that you can only joke about them.
The Russo-American physicist George Gamow was the Institute's practical joker. He made drawings of Bohr's development in which Bohr was depicted as Mickey Mouse.
The work of the Institute was adventure. Every day was a possibility of something new coming up. In a discussion, if no one produced a reaction, Bohr himself would produce the reaction. Bohr played what was almost a one-man game of tennis. We might think that such and such is the case, but if that's the case, then such and such follows. But if that follows, then that would seem to lead to such and such a consequence. But this is absolutely in contrast with what we know is the truth. Therefore, if something is wrong, therefore we have to go back. And so, in this way, he knocked the tennis ball from his side of the court to the other, and then he ran quickly to the other side of the court and got the tennis ball and knocked it back again.
Almost every autumn, an international conference was held, without any prior theme being agreed on in advance. And Bohr always tried to draw those attending into new and unexpected sets of problems.
We told in those days Bohr has one language, the Bohrisch. And this This language has 3 dialects: a Danish dialect, an English dialect, and a German dialect. And the Danish dialect was not easy to be understood.
The great difficulty with Bohr was that he felt the necessity of speaking, and at the same time he didn't trust language. We used to say when Bohr starts speaking as a lecturer, he forgets all the rules of acoustics, of grammar, and of logic. And he says things which we have heard many times, but he thinks he says them for the first time in that clarity in which he now says it. And when it becomes very, very important, then he even puts his hands before his mouth in order that nobody should understand it. He didn't know that he did it for that purpose, but we felt it was the purpose.
Bohr continued to devote his life to science and to the people with whom he collaborated. These friends met in his home and in his summer cottage at Tiswille to continue their discussions and have fun together.
That is typical Bohr. He was a giant of force and activity and enthusiasm, and that was contagious. Everybody who came in touch with him got some of this activity.
Bohr was gifted with a special intuition when it came to choosing the right people to work with him and get them started on their own development. Many of those who became associated with the Institute later made major scientific contributions and won the Nobel Prize themselves, not only in physics, but also in biology and chemistry.
Bohr had a very interesting way of working. He always selected a person which we called the victim among us. And that victim had to sit with him all day. You have to be ready at 9 o'clock and just live with him. Sometimes you had to come out to Carlsberg, to where he lived, and then you had to sit down, and he walked around the table and discussed his ideas, and one had to write down. His thinking was done when he tried to formulate. And I remember one interesting episode there. I was working with him, and it was 6 o'clock in the evening, and I had to go home. But Bohr still had a problem he wanted to discuss with me. So he went with me to the nearest streetcar station. It was number 6 in Carlsberg. And I remember this. He went on talking and talking, and the streetcar came, stopped, and I was on the steps, and he was still going on talking. And people know Bohr very well. You know, he's sort of a well-known figure and a very venerated figure in Copenhagen. So the streetcar just waited. Nobody spoke a word. They waited until Bohr and I have finished our discussion. And then I went in, and Bohr went home, and everybody looked at me like a phenomenon.
The next pursuit at the Institute was to clarify the structure of the nucleus. Bohr made use of the experience he had gained while working on his project on the oscillation of liquid jets, and he suggested that the nucleus might possess characteristics similar to those of a drop. What was needed was a huge, complicated apparatus to facilitate a closer study of the nucleus. A high-voltage generator with a capacity of 1 million volts and a cyclotron for proton acceleration were installed at the Institute. With this equipment, it was possible to change one element into another. The alchemist's ancient dream had come true. What was of interest to the physicists, however, was nuclear reaction.
We could apply what we learned in quantum mechanics of the atom to the quantum mechanics in the nucleus. There was a kind of repeat performance on a much smaller scale and much higher energy. And this development led then to the discovery of fission.
In Europe, there were signs of unrest. The Nazis had taken over in Germany. Their race laws especially were infuriating everyone, and quite contrary to Bohr's ideas of international collaboration and open-mindedness. On his mother's side, he himself was of Jewish descent, and he tried to help Jewish scientists to get out of Germany. Hevesy returned to the Institute, and Bohr sent for a very young scientist, Otto Robert Frisch of Hamburg. When the Germans annexed Austria, Lise Meitner, the Austrian atomic physicist who had been working in Berlin with Otto Hahn and F. Strassmann, fled to Sweden. Otto Frisch, her nephew, visited her in Sweden, and together they went through one of Hahn's and Strassmann's unsuccessful experiments, and suddenly they realized they had witnessed the splitting of a uranium nucleus. It was Bohr's idea that the nucleus could be shaped like a drop that gave them the explanation. Bohr heard the good news just as he was about to leave for Princeton University.
It was a very exciting journey for a young man, and we were four brothers at that time, and that was my parents' wish that we could, each one of us, have a chance to travel with them. So they had one for himself. And it came to my turn in 1939, in the spring of 1939. I was just a student from 1938, and of course I've been preparing myself for this journey and been prepared by my parents, because I had taken a little secretarial course, typing, and I had been educated at Brødrene Anders and how to put things together in a suitcase, so nothing was very greased. So I had to do the packing and be the secretary and assistant and friend and son on this journey. Just before we were leaving, Frisch came and told him of his and Lise Meitner's vision idea, and my father immediately grasped it and said how stupid we have been, and took it with him.
Bohr was coming at Princeton to give lectures on quantum theory. Everybody looked forward to it, because one hoped that out of it would come some agreement between Bohr and Einstein on the subject of the quantum. No one recognized that Bohr would be told just before he left Copenhagen and come to Princeton about the news of the discovery of fission.
The days that were very hard working for my father, because he had now he had started working on. He had also started all this these endeavors of securing that the credit went to the right people, and it was because he was now afraid of that Meitner and Frisch wouldn't get the credit they ought to have for their idea in it.
Otto Frisch made his first attempt at fission in Copenhagen and informed Bohr.
Our work was concerned with how it came about that a nucleus could divide, and how does the probability depend upon the energy. Bohr was wonderful about each new point that came up. He first looked at it one way and then another, as we got together a few hours almost every day. Often he would dictate the conclusions in striking words. On the blackboard, he would write with such force that the chalk cracked under his fingers and the pieces fell to the floor. I can remember our rushing up the staircase in the fine hall to the library on the top floor late at night to look up in all the dictionaries words that might be better than fission to describe the splitting of an atomic nucleus. But in the end, we decided to remain with the word fission. The 16th of March, 1939, Bohr was walking one snowy morning after breakfast across the campus of the university at Princeton, and saying not a word to Rosenfeld. He had told Rosenfeld at breakfast, I have it, but not till he got to Fine Hall did he write on the blackboard the explanation in terms of the picture of nuclear fission. So in the office that had formerly belonged to Einstein, there was an informal meeting of Eugene Wigner and Leo Szilard, who had ideas about how to make a nuclear chain reaction, and Teller and myself and Bohr. And I can recall at that moment Bohr agreeing, yes, it would be possible to make a bomb in principle if one could separate the uranium-235 from the uranium-238. But he said it would take the entire efforts of a nation to do so. Of course, the idea of a bomb was somehow in the air. It had always been there. H.G. Wells had written, long before World War II, a novel in which a bomb proved decisive in a war. And it's a strange thing, it's unbelievable foresight that the material of that bomb was uranium.
Before Bohr returned to Denmark, the Second World War broke out. He was offered a job in America, but wanted to go home. When he got back, the institute was empty. Most of his foreign guests had left because of the war. It was feared that poison gas would be used in the war, and Bohr took advantage of his institute to manufacture equipment for treating victims of gas poisoning. On April the 9th, 1940, Denmark was occupied by the Germans.
Tyske tropper har i nat overskredet den danske grænse og har gjort landgang forskellige steder.
Bohr urged the Danish government to denounce the German race laws. His close friend Werner Heisenberg had not left Germany. With Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, he was working on a German atomic bomb. In 1941, von Weizsäcker and Heisenberg came to Copenhagen to lecture at the German Institute. And Heisenberg visited Bohr.
We were working on nuclear energy in Germany. We had realized in 1941 that most probably we would be unable to make a bomb, and we were not very eager to make one, but we knew very well that it would probably be possible in the end, and we felt it was important to get some understanding between the physicists on both sides during the war that they would agree not to make bombs. But it was quite impossible for us to contact, for instance, the American physicists, and we said the only man in the world who could reach some kind of agreement of this manner would be Niels Bohr. So we decided to go to Copenhagen.
Yes, he talked about it. In fact, I can remember waiting late at night for a taxi in the hall of the House of Honour at Carlsberg, his home, and standing in the middle of the hall, and Bohr walking very agitatedly round and round and round as he remembered the talk with Heisenberg and talked about it.
When Heisenberg came back from the talk, he said, "I am afraid it was a complete failure." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I started very cautiously speaking about the problem of nuclear energy, and when finally he had understood what I was talking about, that I was talking about the possibility of making bombs, he became so upset about this fact that he no longer was able to listen, and so all the things I really wanted to say remained unsaid."
It upset him very much, I think, both at the time and ever afterwards, partly because of the inconsistencies, I think, of what Heisenberg said, but also, I think, by the way it was used after the war in what he regarded as an untruthful way, because there was a well-known book, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns by Robert Jungk, which called this visit by Heisenberg a little-known peace feeler, that Heisenberg had in effect said if all the scientists agree not to make a bomb, and that it put Heisenberg himself in the appearance of being very moral and, as it were, the person who above all felt that science should not work for war and so forth. And I think this was quite untrue.
Bohr never understood, I think, never in his life, what Heisenberg was out after in this talk. And he thought perhaps just that Heisenberg wanted to be fair to him and to tell him that we were intending to make bombs. But this was the opposite of what Heisenberg really wanted to say.
in a secret message hidden in a key. Bohr was invited to go to England to work on an atomic bomb project.
Niels Bohr, who had, together with John Wheeler, given a very good description of the physics of fission, showed that you could not make a weapon with natural uranium, and everybody felt very relieved. But then Frisch, who himself had done experiments about fission, who was with us in Birmingham, one day said to me, what would happen if someone gave you a large quantity of separated uranium, separated isotope, and we thought that out and came to the conclusion that this would have a critical size which was quite small compared to what one intuitively thought might be tons. In fact, it was kilograms. And also that its explosion would lead to a very powerful detonation. So that was the beginning of our interest in weapons. We were very frightened, of course, that the Germans might have it first. And so we persuaded the British authorities to go ahead with the program.
But Bohr declined the offer. He did not think that it would be technically feasible to produce an atomic bomb. He felt that, at this crucial moment, it was his duty to stay in Denmark. In 1943, the Danes began to oppose the German occupation. The Germans declared a state of emergency and martial law, and made their race laws also applicable in Denmark. Within a few days, most of the Danish Jews were smuggled out of Denmark to Sweden. Bohr and his family had to flee too. From Sweden, Bohr and his son O were flown to England. Soon after Bohr's escape, the Germans occupied the institute. Perhaps because they hoped to find information they could use for making their own atomic bomb. In war-torn London, Bohr was asked to go to America, where work on the atomic bomb was being pursued intensively.
For a time, there was some collaboration between the British and the Americans, and then the Americans found they could do it all perfectly well on their own, and they didn't want the British, and they shut the British out. And the British were very alarmed because they realized the whole significance of the atomic project and thought that they realized now that with Britain being bombed and all the strains on manpower, they couldn't do it at home themselves and that they must get into the American project. And it was only after a terrific hassle that Churchill managed to persuade Roosevelt at the Quebec Conference in August 1943 that the British should be allowed into the American project. So that when Niels Bohr arrived in England in September 43, this was a great, as I say, trump card for the British, because the thought that Niels Bohr, the greatest physicist with Einstein in the world, should be part of the British team in America was a great reinforcement of their strength in negotiations with the Americans.
At Los Alamos, Bohr was surprised to meet many of his former collaborators and friends, all working to make an atomic bomb.
One of the great events in Los Alamos was the day Niels Bohr arrived. And Niels Bohr arrived there with Ove, with his son, and they had assumed names. I don't know why, because of security. He was called Nicholas Baker, and his son was called Jim Baker. And we always called him Uncle Nick.
There were a lot of worries by the authorities, in particular by General Groves, who was in charge of the whole atomic energy project, about security, because they thought that if it was known that Niels Bohr was coming to Los Alamos, people might be able to guess what was going on there.
Bohr realized that the atomic bomb would become an accomplished fact. But he was worried about the far-reaching consequences such a bomb would have after the war.
Somehow, in this rather dreary atmosphere of warlike preparations, he came in like a revelation, and he tried to explain to us, although this is a terrible thing, but it may be the great hope. It may be that by developing such a weapon, wars may be impossible in the future.
Well, he was a general consultant. He did not do any detailed work, but he took an interest in the program, and people liked to explain to him what they were doing, and he made useful comments, and I believe in some cases he made some quite practical and useful suggestions.
Throughout his whole life, Bohr was always intent upon openness and international scientific cooperation. The release of atomic energy had such far-reaching perspectives, he believed, that it must be the joint task of the whole world to control its exploitation.
I mean, he had to be, of course, careful to speak about political problems, first as a foreigner, and second because they are rather delicate and sensitive. Then we had small groups to discuss it without him and to go on. And that wasn't very much encouraged by the administration, because they thought we should only do our work and not get into politics and future plans. But we had to, we did it also. And this was definitely Bohr who gave us the occasion and the material to think about.
Bohr communicated his concern to President Roosevelt at the White House. Bohr believed that the Russians ought to be included in the project in order to prevent an arms race after the war.
A Russian project had begun in 1942 as a result of the initiative by a young, very young Russian physicist, and he had made a great discovery of spontaneous fission, and he wanted to get a Stalin Prize for it, but to put in for a Stalin Prize, he had to prove that the discovery was well regarded in the West. So he went to the library and looked through all the American and English physics journals and found not a single reference to nuclear physics. And from that, he was absolutely sure that an atomic project was in progress. And he wrote to Stalin. Nobody else would listen to him. He wrote to Stalin. That was the beginning of the Russian project.
Roosevelt fully appreciated Bohr's concern and sent him to London to talk to Churchill. But Churchill was discouraging. He did not wish to have the Russians informed.
Must be fixed upon the enemy on their front. The only homeward road.
I think it was one of Churchill's bad days. He was obviously in a very bad temper. And I remember Niels Bohr remembered that a lot of the interview was taken up by a row between Churchill and Lord Cherwell, who was his chief scientific advisor and a great personal friend. But they were quarrelling, and I remember Bohr saying that at one stage Churchill said to Cherwell, "I command you not to talk about battleships." And I think that this spread over, obviously, into his talk with Bohr. He really didn't listen, and he didn't like Bohr. I think Bohr was conscious that he didn't like him. Bohr's mild philosophical vagueness of expression and his inarticulate whisper were not the kind of things that appealed to Churchill. He always told people to put everything on one sheet of paper and speak very concisely and so forth. So I don't think the auguries were good anyway.
Bohr returned to America and called on Roosevelt, who told him that he himself would take the matter up with Churchill at the earliest opportunity. More and more scientists at Los Alamos expressed concern.
We regarded it as important that the statesmen and military leaders should be made to understand precisely what this new weapon was and what its consequences were. We knew that people like Oppenheimer were in touch with them, and we trusted them to explain these matters, and we trusted the political leaders as decent people to take responsible decisions. That, in retrospect, perhaps was a little naive.
The Russian scientist Pyotr Kapitsa wrote to Bohr and invited him to Russia. Churchill had been informed about this letter, and Bohr now proposed that he should get in touch with Russian scientists, and Kapitsa in particular, on the subject of nuclear power. At a secret meeting with Roosevelt, Churchill, on the strength of the letter Bohr received from Kapitsa, accused him of being a spy.
What does he mean? He's getting letters from Russian scientists, and Churchill even went so far at one stage to say, you know, Bohr seems to be on the edge of mortal crimes, and possibly he should be locked up, in effect. So that this was one of the disastrous strands in a disastrous story of his interview with Churchill. But no more happened. I mean, that was the end of it, because, as I say, Bohr would never have done anything dishonorable, never.
Roosevelt died, and Truman became president. The atomic bomb project was such a well-guarded secret that not even Truman himself knew the details. Nor did he know of Roosevelt's talks with Bohr. After the German surrender, Truman, Churchill and Stalin met at Potsdam to discuss the continuation of the war with Japan. During this meeting, Truman was told that the first atomic bomb had been successfully detonated at Los Alamos. After talking to Churchill, he merely informed the Russians in vague terms that America now possessed a more powerful bomb which could be used against the Japanese. But Stalin knew better.
A refugee, Klaus Fuchs, who had joined the British project in 1941 and then gone to Los Alamos as part of the British team, was quite an important person at Los Alamos. It was found in the late 1940s that he'd given the Russians every single bit of information he knew, which was a lot.
On August the 6th, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Towards the end of August 1945, Niels Bohr returned to Denmark and the institute where his Danish colleagues were awaiting him. They had reverted to their normal daily life. Scientific work continued, but the world had been changed by the war and by the atomic bomb. Bohr's attempt to achieve international cooperation on atomic energy had failed. But he had hopes for the newly established United Nations. He continued to work towards international cooperation and mutual arms inspection, especially in an open letter to the United Nations. He pointed out the serious problems and the great responsibilities confronting mankind now that nuclear energy was about to be exploited.
By the time the open letter, of course, was published in 1950, it was a time of the Korean War, the Cold War was at its height, and no moment could have been less propitious for it. And I think because of this, it's tended to seem a rather woolly, you know, just the kind of thing you might think from an aging scientist and so forth. But I think it was far more hard-headed than that.
Bohr saw the necessity of big physics on a large scale, like at CERN and other of these big institutions, because this was the continuation of his life work. He saw that it is necessary to have not only on a big scale, but on the international scale, because science goes over all limits of nationality or politics. And when Niels Bohr died, an era ended. He was the great creator of modern science. And somehow his death symbolized his life. It was in the midst of activity. He chaired a meeting, and then he went home where there should be a party in his house, and he was just lying down for a rest, and he never woke up. What a life and what a death.
The open letter, I think, embodies something very practical and something very idealistic. On the practical side, he foresaw many of the things that have happened in weaponry. He foresaw that the atomic bomb, the thermonuclear bombs would follow, the chemical and biological warfare, there would be a revolution in communications technology and so forth. And I think he realized that it was just not going to be possible for one country to keep a secret for very long. Therefore, why try?
Fordybelsen i sådanne problemer, i kilder til de misforståelser, der kommer op ved forbindelse imellem mennesker og forskellige kulturer. Det, tør man håbe, kunne vise vej til bedre forståelse imellem folkeslagene. En forståelse, der jo nu om stunder er mere nødvendig end nogensinde. Nu hvor videnskabens udvikling har givet rummer så store løfter for forbedring af menneskenes levevilkår, og som samtidig gør det mere nødvendigt end nogensinde, at vi på vores lille klode finder frem til veje for fredeligt samarbejde på den fælles menneskekulturs udvikling og fremgang. Det er ikke mindst inden for det videnskabelige samarbejde, at man kan håbe, at sådanne bestræbelser befremmes. I det vi her, måske mere end nogensinde noget andet område, føler, at man på forskellige grundlag stræber efter det samme mål. At forøge vores erfaring og uddybe vores kendelse af den natur, hvori at vi selv er del.